Greetings, Ted Morrissey here, making a video for my revisionist Shakespeare class, and specifically we'll be talking a little bit about the Winter's Tale. I'm wearing my Mark Twain Cave Hannibal hoodie sweatshirt thing because, well, I live close to Hannibal, and I really like Hannibal because of all the Mark Twain stuff. But in connection with, it's kind of hot though, in connection with Shakespeare, Mark Twain was one of the doubters, as you no doubt know. There's been this raging controversy for the last, I don't know, 150 years about whether or not Shakespeare of Stratford actually wrote the plays. And Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, was one of those famous voices that didn't think he did. And so he contributed to the conspiracy theory that other people besides Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, just for the record. But I do like Mark Twain. I like Hannibal, so I decided to wear the sweatshirt. So, like I said, we are going to talk Winter's Tale. But before we get to that, I want to return briefly to another subject. We were talking about Othello, and we were talking about character motivation in Shakespeare's day, and that in Shakespeare's plays, he doesn't seem overly concerned with motivation of why the characters do what they do, much more interested in the effect of it. And I didn't really, offer an explanation for that other than just in his time period, that was just kind of the way they felt about things. They weren't as interested in character motivation as we seem to be. Also, he did have a limited amount of time, and he preferred to spend, the bulk of his time on the stage with the actors on the stage, looking at the effects of the action, not the motivation behind it. In the meanwhile, though, I have been reading this book, 20th century critical essays on interpretations on the book of Job. I'm doing this for my own book. I'm working on my newest novel. Have a draft of, I think, a complete draft of, and I've been working on revising, but revising is kind of turning into adding more stuff to it, which usually is what revising involves for me, but in this case, it's quite a bit more stuff. But anyway, we'll see. I'm not sure where I'm at and all that, but part of the revision process, I want to look in a little more deeply to the book of Job, because it is sort of a metaphor running through the novel. And I thought maybe by getting some other perspectives on Job, that might fuel my ideas about revision. And actually, it's working. I'm getting some ideas because of reading this. But one of the essays in here, this is by Eugene Goodhart, and it's from his contribution to this book called Job and the Modern World. And he's specifically writing about Kierkegaard and his sort of retelling of the Job story. And he writes how the biblical narrative has been altered by the act of conceiving the inner lives of Abraham and Isaac. Brilliant as Kierkegaard's reading is, it is a typical instance of the modern refusal to accept the mystery of the story. It is an instance of the modern need to rationalize it by fleshing it out with the psychological and more detail of our own experience. As in the story of the sacrifice, the truth of Job lies not in what is absent or hidden, it lies chiefly in what the work reveals. But what I think is interesting about that is because it directly, bears on what we were talking about in terms of character motivation. So according to Goodhart, before the 20th century, basically, writers and therefore readers and audiences of live productions and so forth, their sense of psychology, their knowledge of psychology was much more limited than our sense. Now, psychology is really an invention of primarily the 20th century. Not that people didn't have psychological, issues and reactions to things for millions of years. It just wasn't sort of scientifically analyzed and categorized until really beginning in the late 19th century, but certainly into the 20th century, with Freud and other kind of pioneering psychoanalysts and psychologists and so on. So until the invention of psychology, Goodhart is saying, with basically the advent of the 20th century, more or less, that brought with it a more of an interest in character motivation. Than prior to that, it just wasn't as much of a concern for writers, readers, audience members, and so forth. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I hadn't thought about why older audiences maybe didn't concern themselves as much with motivation, and more recent audiences, that's a bigger deal. Where character motivation is very, very important. So Goodhart puts forward the idea that it corresponds with the invention, so to speak, of psychology, and how that's impacted narrative and so forth. Anyway, just wanted to share that, even though we aren't dealing with the Book of Job. There is another article in there that does a really interesting analysis of the Book of Job compared to Job as a character, rather, compared to King Lear. So looks at that Shakespeare play, compared to the biblical story of Job, and really interesting parallels that it's drawing and so forth. But we're interested in The Winter's Tale, and I love The Winter's Tale. I know I say that about everything, but it's true about The Winter's Tale. I may love it best of all. Next week, I'm sure I'll say that I love The Tempest best of all. But for this week, I love The Winter's Tale best of all. And the thing I love about The Winter's Tale is its weirdness. As you know, especially if you've had a course or two with me, I value above all things risk-taking. I don't like it when writers play it safe. And Shakespeare certainly was not playing it safe with The Winter's Tale. As we've talked about before, and as you wrote about in your discussion posts, we have these two very, very different stories. It's a very, very dark, tragic tale about jealousy and so forth. And then we have this very upbeat, sort of romantic tale. And we have this very happy ending, well, as happy of an ending as you could have, given all the tragedy leading up to it. But two very different kinds of plays. Very, very dark tragedy, very light kind of comedy, romance kind of thing. And we know that when Shakespeare first produced the play, there's some evidence that it had some popularity when it was first produced. But pretty quickly, after Shakespeare's death and so on, and as his canon was kind of being reevaluated over the 17th and 18th centuries and so on, The Winter's Tale really fell out of favor. It was seen as just this really poorly conceived, poorly executed kind of play, for by most critics. In fact, some readers of Shakespeare, some lovers of Shakespeare, even went so far as to make the case that it couldn't possibly have been written by Shakespeare because it was so bad, and that it must have been somebody else's play. Maybe Shakespeare contributed a little bit to it here and there, but it was really somebody else's play, and it just got mislabeled as Shakespeare's, and it shouldn't even be part of the canon, and so forth and so on. And that view, like I said, persisted really, throughout the 19th century. And it wasn't until probably the 20th century-ish that the tide sort of turned and it started to be seen in a much more positive light. And maybe with the advent of modernism, and then certainly postmodernism, that it was seen in a much more favorable way, and now is considered, of course, one of the classics, like all the other classics of Shakespeare, right? And it's got an interesting history. So we know that Shakespeare was extremely popular in at the peak of his career. Obviously, that's why his career was peaking, because he was popular. And so we're talking about the early 1600s. You've got all of the all the great tragedies. Now you've got Hamlet, you've got Othello, you've got Lear, you've got Macbeth, you've got Antony and Cleopatra. A little earlier, you got Romeo and Juliet. You've got The Taming of the Shrew a little earlier than that. So all these plays that are very, very popular and catapulting Shakespeare to the top of the London theater scene when King James is coronated in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth. He adopts, patronizes Shakespeare's company, so they are elevated from being the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men, which was a huge deal. Not partly for just status, of course, and they were regularly invited to court, to perform. And James was a big fan of drama and literature in general, and so he frequently invited them to court. Shakespeare was part of his coronation celebration, etc. But also very important because in that time period, every play had to be approved by the government censor before it could be performed and before you could make money off of it. And so if you had a powerful patron behind you, it was more likely to pass censorship issues, or not to be censored, and get kind of streamlined through the process so that you could start performing it more quickly. And there was no more powerful patron than the king, of course. So financially, it was very useful to Shakespeare and his company to become the king's man, and so on. So he was riding high, for a number of years, a decade or more. But the great Shakespeare scholar Emma Smith, who I know I sing her praises frequently, as well I should, 'cause she's a terrific scholar. She has put forward, based on her research, the idea that Shakespeare, yes, was extremely popular, but his career did start to go on the decline. When we get near the end of that decade into 1609, 1610, that his popularity is waning. In fact, by that point, not even the King's Men are doing mainly Shakespeare's plays. For a number of years, they would do plays by other playwrights besides Shakespeare, but primarily they use Shakespeare's work. But by the end of that decade, again around 1610 or so, his star had kind of fallen, and they were mainly doing other playwrights' plays. And she speculates that maybe that led to his pretty much retiring from the theater and going back to Stratford and so on. So that those last plays are really interesting, if you put them in that context. And of course, The Winter's Tale, we usually assign the date of 1611. We're not quite sure, but right around in there. But certainly in that period where Shakespeare's popularity is fading, according to Emma Smith's research. And a year or two before Shakespeare wrote The Winter's Tale, his presumably friend, but certainly colleague, oftentimes co-author, collaborator, John Fletcher. We know they worked together frequently and contributed to each other's plays, and the King's Men put on several of John Fletcher's plays over the years. And John Fletcher had tried a sort of experimental piece of his own, which was called The Faithful Shepherdess. And it was a tragicomedy where he tried to combine elements of tragedy and elements of comedy into one show. The King's Men performed it, and according to all accounts, it was a dismal failure. And he presumed that what happened was he didn't go far enough. He wasn't bold enough. I'm paraphrasing here liberally. He wasn't bold enough in terms of trying to marry these two different forms together. And so then, like I said, we're not quite sure of the timing, but let's say a year or two later, Shakespeare writes The Winter's Tale, which is where he tries to do the same thing that Fletcher had done, but he just goes, all in, right? So he goes extreme tragic, story on one end, and extreme comedy, romance on the other end, and puts them together. And like I said, at first, the earliest audiences seem to like it, and so on. But I think one of the things that we can draw as writers from this, I mean, it's all very interesting. I'm fascinated by all that stuff, and hopefully you are a little bit too. Otherwise, up to this point, you've been bored to tears. But I think as writers, what I like to take away from that, and what I'll kind of encourage you to take away from it, is that sense of experimentation. So if Emma Smith is right, and I think she is, but if she's right and his career was, waning by that point, it must have been difficult, to go from being so popular within just a few years to having your popularity be so much on the decline. Think about modern, examples of that: actors, directors, musical groups, performers, whatever you want to say, who are riding high for a number of years, and then they, hit the skids for whatever reason, right? Their popularity just kind of wanes, and just the tastes of the audience change, or maybe something, happens to change their fortune, and how difficult that is, right, psychologically for them, and so on. And of course, a lot of people never recover from that. They never make a comeback or whatever. And so I like to think of Shakespeare having that sort of artistic dilemma where he was riding high, was the most popular playwright in London, and then the tides turned, the audiences got different expectations, about what they wanted, and his work wasn't as popular anymore. And I think it would have been very easy at that point for him either just to quit altogether, and never write another word, or to go back to some of the forms that he had written earlier, which were successful, to try to kind of resurrect some of those kinds of stories, try to write another Hamlet, try to write another Macbeth, another Romeo and Juliet or whatever. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he gives us The Winter's Tale, highly experimental, in terms of putting these two starkly different kinds of stories together, fusing them, frankly, without a lot of kind of artistic glue, if you will. They sort of, distinctly stand apart. I mean, you can find some ways of sort of making them work together artistically, but pretty stark contrasts, right? He also gives us The Tempest, which is also unusual compared to the rest of his work, and we'll talk more about that when we get to The Tempest, and maybe I've already alluded to it before. But he gives us The Winter's Tale, and it was risky. And like I said, for audiences for a couple hundred years, they didn't really get it, didn't really like it, had a hard time sort of dealing with it. But now, 400 years later, it's considered one of the classics, and so forth. I think as writers, that sort of risk taking is something that we should try, right? We should be willing to try. We should be willing to try new forms. We should be willing to take some artistic risks, and we just never know what's going to click and what isn't going to click. Now, is it going to be popular? Are we going to end up with a house in the Hamptons? Maybe not, probably not. But is it worth trying? Is it worth, the artistic effort? I think so. I think we can find examples. I mean, I would point to the musical Hamilton. If we go back a few years, 5 years or whatever, and we were to say to somebody, "Oh, we got this idea for this play about the founding fathers, and it's going to be, it's going to use rap music, and it's going to have, people of color, playing, Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington and playing with all those kinds of images and so forth, I don't know that people would say, "Oh my gosh, that is a you got a hit, Broadway hit on your hands. That's gonna be a fantastic." I don't think that would have been the immediate reaction of most people again, say 5 years ago. But here we are, right? And I think we can find other examples of things that didn't um, maybe sound like they were going to be particularly well received. They were really kind of out there, uh, concept wise, but yet for whatever reason, they just click. They really, really work. And I think it's important to underscore the commitment to it. So, like with Hamilton, for example, you could have sort of done Hamilton and stuck a little more traditional, maybe in terms of the music, maybe in terms of the casting. You could have found ways to not have it be quite such a radical departure from your typical, 1776 kind of play or whatever, right? Musical. But didn't committed to the full treatment, as far out on the limb as you could possibly get, and it worked. Shakespeare, same thing with the Winter's Tale. Could have played it a little safer, like apparently Fletcher did a year or two before, but Shakespeare, maybe the lesson he learned from that is not to be timid. If you're going to try to fuse these different forms together, just do it. Do it. In as fully and as deliberately and in much contrast as you can, and just see where it goes. Right. So again, I think that would be the main lesson I would hope we could take from this. This idea of experimentation, not to be afraid of experimentation, not to be afraid of mixing forms, and if we're going to do it, just do it, and don't hesitate, don't play it safe. That's probably maybe a recipe for mediocrity and so forth. All right. Before I leave you, I did want to draw a little bit from the introduction to this is the Pelican Shakespeare edition, one of the many I've got lying around here, and this is written by the editor Francis E. Dolan. And I wanted to read this because it talks a little bit about the Winter's Tale in comparison to Othello, and since we just read Othello a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to you know read a little bit from this just because I think it has some interesting things to say about the two. And like I said, you're going to obviously be doing some revisionist work of your own, so who knows, it might help you see that in a little bit different way as well. So he writes, the Winter's Tale can be viewed as a revision of Othello, for in it a similar conflict and cast find comic rather than tragic resolution. The wrongly accused wife is vindicated and restored. The outspoken woman does not die. The hero learns and grows rather than killing himself. Why can this play work out so much better than Othello does? Genre, of course, but the question of genre is connected to the grace that pervades the play, for it is grace that lifts the doom and opens up the horizons of a dark, cramped, cold, tragic world. Time is also crucial to the difference in genre. While the time frame of Othello is sharply compressed, leaving no time for reflection or doubt, the wide gap of time here in The Winter's Tale expands possibilities. The duration of the play the duration in the play also makes it possible to conjoin the generational concerns of both tragedy and comedy. Shakespearean comedy generally attends to marriageable young people as they define their identities and make matches. Their parents are sometimes obstacles, but most often irrelevant. Shakespearean tragedy often considers conflicts between the generations as well as the ways in which parental grievances and failures haunt and blight the next generation. In The Winter's Tale, we are invited to care equally about the marriageable young people and their estranged parents, about how parental mistakes shape children's options, but also how children can make old hearts fresh. Right? So, so again, interesting point that we have a lot of the same elements in The Winter's Tale that we had in Othello, but in each case they're sort of turned, 180 degrees. And the author of the introduction, Dolan, suggests that in large part it's because of genre, tragedy versus comedy, but also time span affects that. The age of the characters affects that, and so forth. So, I think as we go forward, we, as writers, beyond this course and so on, I think we oftentimes can use our own work as kind of a springboard for new work, right? We can take a lot of the scenarios that maybe we have worked with previously and maybe successfully, and see if we can sort of twist them a little bit, and maybe come up with a very different kind of narrative by using essentially the same component pieces, but just looking at them in a different light, expanding the time frame, switching the characters generationally from young people to old people or vice versa. All kinds of different twists like that, which can take the same narrative elements and make them work out in very different kinds of ways. All right. So I'll leave you with that thought. Maybe you could respond a little bit with your sense of experimentation, your sense of really committing to whatever experiment you're working with, or maybe this idea of taking pieces you've already worked with previously and sort of turning them around somehow or another to get a different sort of narrative out of the same sorts of set pieces. All right, so I will stop there, and I will look forward to seeing you down the road.